Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation titled Thomas Paine v. Abbe Renaud, presented today by me, Dustin West. This presentation corresponds with the Week 5 further readings for the First British Empire, that is part of the History 431 class, Cultures of Imperialism, that is conducted by Dr. Justin Beal at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And today what I'm going to do is make the connection between the two further readings by Thomas Paine, Common Sense, and his letter to Abbe Renaud, to the readings that the rest of the class conducted this week, called Histoire des deux Indies, volumes 5 and 6, by Guillaume Thomas François Renaud. And so, for starters, I'm going to give a brief summary of both writings by Thomas Paine. And since it was published first in 1776, I will talk about Common Sense. Common Sense was published in January of 1776 and was an attempt to gain more colonial support for the movement against the British Empire. What I noticed during my readings of Common Sense that there was three main arguments that I can pinpoint that really all work together, and they're all grievances, I would say, against the government system of the British Empire. And so the first one, for starters, is arguments against rule by kings. Now, this one was one of the very first ones that he points out. And the first quote that I have here is, quote, "It is the pride of kings which throw mankind into confusion," unquote, and that this is the idea that king's pride is something that's very valued. And I think this really works well with the second quote here, where he talks about the King of England himself, where he says, "The King of England has, quote, little more to do than make war and give away places," unquote. And so I think this is kind of a direct response to the idea that kings are greedy, they're war mongers, and also where he talks about the king has little more to do than make war. I think this also could be a response to the parliamentary government that Britain has, that the parliament makes the laws. And then, speaking of parliament, the second part is the inefficiency of parliament and what I said Mother Britain. And I say Mother Britain because it seemed to be a very common motif in some of the arguments against Thomas Paine's ideas in Common Sense. So he addresses these arguments by saying, quote, "But Britain is the parent country, some say," unquote. And after he mentions this quotation, he says that people talk about how Britain is like a mother to the American colonies, where Britain helped make America flourish. It brought it people, it made it better, and things like this. And Paine disputes this. Paine talks about how that the relationship and the connection between American colonies and Britain has been nothing but a disaster. That and one of the, I thought was probably one of the most interesting claims that he has was that the connections that Britain had with Spain and France caused a lot more issues than they could have in America. And he talks about how if America had no connection to England, that perhaps there would be no conflicts between France and Spain. This next quote here is him talking about the idea of, I would say, Mother Britain. And so where he says, quote, "Even brutes do not devour their young," unquote. And that this is the idea that Britain, how she's treating the Americas because of the taxes and the unequal treatment that she's giving them post 1763 or French and Indian War, that it's worse than what a brute would do to its own children. That a brute wouldn't treat its children this bad. It wouldn't devour its young. It wouldn't start conflicts. And that's one main part of Paine's argument, is that there was no conflicts before this 7 years French-Indian War that ended in 1763. But after that, with the Stamp Act and other tax acts, that's when Britain was, I would say, maybe misusing the American colonies. And after this quotation, he talks about, he compares America to a nursing infant. That when people say that why should we leave if this is our mother country and it helps us flourish, he brings up the idea that like an infant can only nurse on its mother for so long before it has to grow out and live on its own. Another discrepancy that he talks about against Britain and Parliament is the idea that Parliament just takes too long to get information back to the United States, or to America, excuse me. It takes way too long to get information back, and it's very inefficient. And the last part of Common Sense that he talks about is King of America. And this is the idea that in Europe, kings are absolute monarchies, they have all power, they're there by divine right, and that here in America it is a more enlightenment kind of thinking, that things should be ruled by reason, and that he says, quote, that in America law is king, unquote. So this is the idea that the reason of law should be the governing body for the people in America, and this is something that he brings up with the idea of, if there is no king, then where does the power lie? And he talks about that the crown should be, quote, demolished and scattered amongst the people whose right it is, unquote. And this is the idea that everyone's equal, everyone should have a say, and that everyone should be able to contribute in government. And so the next reading that I had from Thomas Paine was his response to Renan, which was published in 1783. And this was a direct response to Renan's volumes that we read for this week. And so one of the first arguments that you would notice in this in this letter is on page 7 of his argument. He quotes Renan's comment on, quote, knowing whether the mother country had the right to lay, direct or indirectly, a slight tax upon the colonies, unquote. And this is from Renan's volume 6, book 18, page 181, or 186, excuse me. And so after this, he talks about how Renan is completely forgetting about the part that before 1763, that the colonists never thought about wanting to rebel or protest against the British Empire, that everything was going well, and only after these acts, and he starts referencing off the Stamp Act and stuff like that very, very rapidly, and that only after these acts did these discrepancies kind of show up. And this, I think, was one of his key arguments against Renan, and I will mention another one in my analyzing them. And the other one that I noticed, and this was another really early one, where he confronts Renan's writing of the history of the American Revolution as it's happening. And so he says on page 6, quote, it is yet too soon to write the history of the Revolution, and whoever attempts it precipitately will unavoidably mistake characters and circumstances and involve himself in error and difficulty. Things like men are seldom understood rightfully at first sight, unquote. And this, I think, directly ties in to the analysis comparison that I will talk about next, that Renan is only going to be making assumptions about what's going on in America as he lives in France. And so I think what Paine is trying to address here is that to really understand what's going on, you have to either see it for yourself or wait for things to kind of go through and see what happens. And so now the second portion of this video is going to be analyzing Paine versus Renan. And this ties right back in to the, I guess, the kind of assumptions that Paine thinks that Renan is going to make, and that this is what I call the case of rights. And this is definitely a clash between, I would say, old world, traditional European way of thinking and an Enlightenment way of thinking. And so I'm going to start out by mentioning this rhetoric that was very common in the American colonies at this time. In my paper for this week, I mentioned that this rhetoric was embraced by Paine but dismissed by Renan. And this rhetoric is, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, unquote. This probably sounds very familiar to all of you. This is from the Declaration of Independence, and this was one of the very key arguments that the American colonists had against the British monarch and British Parliament, that we're not being treated fairly in comparison to the rest of the British people who live within the empire. And so Renan disputes this. He absolutely does not believe that men are all created equal, and he really goes in depth on this in page 140 in volume 6, book 18, where he says, quote, it hath been said that we are all born equals, but that's not true, unquote. And he also goes on to say in the next paragraph, quote, there is an original inequality between men which nothing can be remedied, unquote. And what I thought about this was that this is him viewing in a very classical European way of viewing things in a hierarchy, where you have your king at the top, your clergy, your nobles, and then your peasants. And this is how Europe was ran during the feudal age, where everything had a hierarchy, everybody had a rank, and the idea that all men are created equal was not going to sit well. Because if you're a peasant farmer, there's no way that you're going to be equal to the noble lord that rules over you. And he puts this kind of, I think, into a perspective on his view later on in the page where he says, quote, "But hath not nature herself produced the seeds of tyranny by dealing with her children like a stepmother, by creating some children weak and others strong," unquote. I think that really enforces the idea that everything has a rank and everything has an order that it needs to go. And you can't be, in his mind, you can't be equal because some people are born weak and some people are born strong. So, as the rebuttal to this argument, in Paine's response to his letter from Abe, where he absolutely disputes this view, he sees that all men are created equal. However, one thing that I noticed was that these two would agree that there was nothing wrong with the government before 1763. And that was one thing that Paine really mentions in his letter back to Raynal, is that you're looking at the colonies before 1763, not after. That's when things change. And I think this first quote kind of reflects that. It's on page 8 of his letter to Abe. It says, "If then the Stamp Act was an inspiration of Americans' most precious and sacred rights, then the Declaratory Act left them no rights at all, and contained the full growth seeds of the most despotic government ever exercised in the world," unquote. And so I think this right here really sums up the idea that Paine has against, like, his idea of grievance against the British Empire. That we had no quarrel before these acts started to come, and only when these acts started to come did the colonists start to feel that their rights were being infringed upon. And the second quote here, which I'll say in just a minute, is really, I think, the justification of why American colonists were ready to grab their arms and go straight to battle against the British. That this idea of rights was very prized to them. And he says, quote, "that as the Americans united in this arduous contest upon principles of common interest for the defense of common rights and privileges, which union hath been cemented upon common calamities," unquote. And so I think that this is really just Paine showing that, according to him, that through, I would say, an enlightened way of thinking, that people have rights. People should not be ruled by kings, that law should prevail and reason should prevail, which this is pretty much a foundation quality that I think that we see in the United States. And this is something that he thinks people are willing to fight for, and this is why he wrote Common Sense. And so this ends my portion of the video where I can analyze Paine and Raynal's arguments. My question for you guys is, what do you think? Do you think Paine or Raynal has a better view, I guess? Do you feel that Raynal's way of thinking is the correct way of thinking, or do you think Paine's way of thinking is the correct way of thinking? I view Paine as kind of the more enlightened view, the new view where people are viewed as equals, while Raynal is relying on traditional views of people have an order and a rank. Let me know, and thank you for watching.